This is the Dover Download Podcast. My name is Christopher Parker, and for the past 25 years, I've had the pleasure of working with, learning from, and talking to a variety of volunteer, staff, and community members. This podcast explores conversations, activities, and a variety of policies and programs which exist here in Dover to improve the community in one way or another. As we've discussed numerous times on the podcast, the City of Dover is very much wedded to the idea of strategic planning, and we do our operations plans, but we also have a master plan, and the master plan has a variety of chapters. Today, we're going to talk with Dr. Gaspari and Aaron Bisagio from the Planning Department about the current plan we are working on, or the current chapter of the plan we are working on. Gentlemen and lady, welcome.
Thanks, Chris.
Thanks for having us on.
So what chapter are we working on?
We are working on the Conservation and Open Space chapter of the master plan, which was last updated in 2012. So we're looking at current environmental management practices and our goals for the future in that space.
I would think that in this area, there's been a pretty dramatic change over the past 10 years. I know in the meantime, we did the Stewardship of Resources chapter and the Climate Adaptation chapter, and we've really seen some evolution within this sort of area of thought.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, as you mentioned, those other two chapters lay some great foundation for ideas going into the current chapter update. I think there is new focus on making sure that conservation projects are representing the priorities of the community as a whole, and we've been able to leverage in this chapter update some more advanced GIS techniques and tools, which we can get into a little bit later.
What's pretty interesting is the use of technology has really broadened, not just over the 25 years that I've been working with master plans here, but just even in the past 5 to 10 years, thinking about the story mapping and other techniques that you both are introducing into these chapters. I remember looking at when we did the rec chapter a few years ago and looking at the use of GIS and the use of overlay maps and concurrence analysis. I got to think it's even more so on an environmental standpoint.
Yeah, and it's certainly been central in these efforts so far for this project update. And we've been working on co-occurrence mapping and weighting the priority of resources in Dover, and that's been an active effort with both our consultant partners and our steering committee for the project. So far, we've created some maps that both inventory current conservation tracks and also looking at potential areas for conservation in the future.
You mentioned the consulting and the steering committee. Both are very important elements of this because as skilled and knowledgeable as you are as a staff level, you always need some experience and you need community representation. What's the makeup of the steering committee?
We have an all-star steering committee working on this master plan chapter. The makeup includes the Deputy Mayor Shanahan, Councilor Williams, who is the alternate, Kristen Murphy representing the Conservation Commission Open Lands Committee. We have Russ Warnock, who's involved with our Conservation Commission, also the Forest Management Subcommittee, and he's a certified arborist, so he does a lot of this type of work professionally, which is excellent. Tom Fargo has also joined in. Tom was the Conservation Commission chair for about a decade and has some really good institutional knowledge that he's bringing to the table throughout the process. And then Mark Spidell is our planning board rep, and Mark has been great at bringing insights from the planning board level.
And I would assume as you went through those names, a lot of them are long-term residents. So you get some historical perspective, but then you also mentioned some people that haven't been in the community. I'll use Tom as an example, or Mark, who've been here as long as I've been here. So they are going to bring a perspective and a knowledge base, but you need to make sure that they're not dominating. So you have some more newer community members as well, which is great.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned the consultant team, so we should give them a shout out.
I was going to ask Aaron to do that.
Resilience Planning and Design. Steve Whitman and crew have been excellent working with us on this chapter update. They had just assisted the city with the vision chapter as well, so we do have a history with them. And they bring a lot of knowledge, specifically in the GIS space and community outreach space, which I think are two really critical components of this work.
You're right. They have done, I want to say, pretty much all but the rec chapter over the past decade. I think they've been involved in a variety of roles with us under their current guise, and then previously when Steve was partnered with Jeff Taylor had done work for us. So it's great to have that sort of perspective as well, I would assume.
It is, yeah, especially coming off just completing our vision chapter, which talked a lot about conservation efforts and goals for the future, the vision that residents have for the future of Dover for conservation as well as recreation access to those lands. So it was a good continuation of that work with resilience.
So Aaron, every time we interview you about these sorts of projects, you're looking at newer and different community engagement tools and processes. Are you continuing to change those up, or are you settled into some now tried and true methods?
I'm glad you asked. We just completed with Resilience Planning and the Steering Committee a story map, and a story map using GIS technology that you were just talking about brings together kind of a visual story, as it suggests, of the conservation lands throughout the city of Dover, talks about the project, what we've been working on so far, but also gives the opportunity for residents and stakeholders to give feedback on the subject matter, but also looking at mapping and picking which areas that they would prioritize for conservation, as well as different types of conservation they can learn about and respond to kind of how they feel about those different topics.
I think I've spoken at least to you, Aaron, about this, but maybe Jackson as well. In 2015, when I was the planning director, the American Planning Association National Conference was in Seattle, and I attended a session about their master planning. They call it comprehensive planning, as most of the rest of the country does. And they were totally transitioned at that point to digital only, and they were using story mapping. They really didn't have a physical master plan, and their whole point was you went to this website, you selected the theme you were interested in, and then it led you through in this storyboarding sort of fashion. And I remember, I think Steve Whitman was at that as well. He wasn't in the session, but he was there, and we met up for lunch, and I was like, you gotta do this. And he was like, so do you understand how much money those communities have to put towards these projects? And we did some research. I think Donna had just come on board in a planner role, and she and I did some research about the feasibility. I still think at some point, as costs come down and as technology improves and it becomes more user-friendly, and I recognize the state still requires us to have a master plan, and certainly we want to have the library have copies in the clerk's office, et cetera, but I would love to see us really create a interactive document where I think it becomes more readable, more usable. Because if it's not readable and usable, it doesn't matter. But I'll get off my diatribe now. What are we looking at for a timeline here? Are we in the early stages? Are we in the middle stages? Are you about to release the final draft? Where are you in the process?
The steering committee first met right after the new year in January. So this has been in progress for around 7 months now. And actually the timing of this effort was quite good in that on the other side in this space, we've been conducting a natural resources inventory with partners at Stratford Regional Planning Commission and utilizing a team at FB Environmental to do a rapid ecological study as part of this. So all of that has provided some really valuable information, not only on the GIS side, which has set up RP&D for doing some more intense analysis than maybe they could have done otherwise, but also on the community feedback side. There is a survey as part of that NRI process that was super helpful in kind of setting up this master plan chapter effort for even more success. But we would expect the chapter to likely be completed this fall. So we are nearing sort of the end of the process, but we're really trying to get that good public engagement and feedback, specifically with the story map at this point in time.
So Aaron, what are ways that people can engage with the work the committee is doing?
So the story map that I was just mentioning is our current big push to get resident feedback. However, we also have an open feedback form on our project website, which is on the City of Dover website, and residents can find there. And that's kind of just for general feedback as the project moves along. But we do encourage residents to mainly respond to our story map at the moment. It's a great opportunity to learn about the project, but also provide feedback again on where specifically residents might want conservation efforts to be focused in the future, but also what types of conservation, whether that's public access or other types of conservation and open space, which can also include open space subdivisions, which obviously we work with in the planning department.
That struggle that you were, or not struggle, but the options you were just laying out, in my mind, it kind of does lay a struggle out, because on the one hand, you've got this push to have land preservation. On the other hand, there's a need for housing, there's a need for continued evolution of land use options. And at the same time, when you dig down, is it enough to preserve land, or do you have to add public access? And when you start adding public access, what does that do to the wildlife habitat? And how does the fragmentation come into that? And at the same time, you've got this whole other level that Jackson, you and I have talked about resiliency, and how resiliency covers conservation, but more. So are there opportunities to say we're going to preserve this land, but we're going to use it for a community garden, or we're going to create these sort of resources that might offset some of the over-densification that people see in other areas of the community?
Yeah, no, thank you for bringing that up, Chris. I'd say the steering committee has placed some emphasis on, really trying to improve public access and accessibility on current lands that are open to the public. I think in the future we would like to see more conservation projects that are open to the public, as they do provide some great benefits. Connectivity has been a big part of the conversations as well, in that, with transfer of development rights, which is allowing for this dense development to kind of balance with our land conservation efforts, which I think has been really successful overall. We really owe it to the folks that live in the urban core to provide them opportunities to get out in nature and hopefully be able to access that in a really pretty accessible and straightforward way.
A few minutes ago, I talked about the digital format. I'm curious, you both have been doing this long enough, and you both had experience with a variety of chapters, and I'm assuming, though I know what my mother would tell me what happens when you assume, that you both have done research into what other communities are doing, or Steve and his team have said, here are some options. If money was not a concern, and yes, it is a concern, but if money was not a constraint or a concern, what sort of chapter elements would you like to advise the community to include? Whether it's a format, whether it's an area that we should focus on?
I think with this chapter in particular, we've talked more about visuals and how to make it accessible. These topics that we're talking about, not just kind of a static map, but something interactive. And one thing we talked about was, showing conservation efforts through the years, whether that would be on a story map, kind of a slider aspect of showing those conservation tracks expanding and growing throughout the years, just making the whole subject matter as a whole more accessible and understandable. I think that's a big part of what we've been talking about for this.
Yeah, thanks for bringing up the slider, Aaron. There was some requests from the Open Lands Committee to really show the progress over time that Dover has made in conserving lands with high conservation value. And instead of just having one stagnant map, which isn't too interactive, it can be informative, but you don't learn a ton from it potentially, to have this sort of time slider feature that you can look at decade by decade where areas in Dover have been conserved and how that's been balancing this growth and density that we're seeing elsewhere.
Yeah, I remember years ago, Steve Bird saying that one of the things, it might have been the last time we did this chapter in 2012, that it's important to recognize successes.
Yes.
It's important to say, in 2000, when the Open Lands Committee was just being formed, this is the percent of the community that was covered by land preservation efforts. Here's where we're at today, and that leap, now 24 years, at the time 12 years, is pretty substantial, and the community as a whole should be supportive and proud of its efforts to make that move. And it also, at that point, allows us to step back and say, okay, let's prioritize it. Not everything is the most cherished brownfield. So let's make sure that the efforts and the resources are being poignant, as it were. We don't want to target things, but I think we want to be thoughtful about what you spend your time on as staff and what the volunteers focus on.
Absolutely. And that process has really evolved over the years. And I think we have a very good sort of operating procedure on how our volunteers and city deals with land conservation efforts. The Open Lands Committee has what they like to call the 21 steps in land conservation. And it's, it does take time because these are sort of sensitive things, and you're working with landowners over, sometimes many years to make these projects come to fruition. But it's so incredibly rewarding at the end of the day to help a community member achieve their goal of having their land protected in perpetuity. I mean, the excitement that those folks get and the city gets and the volunteers get from that is really rewarding.
It takes time, and I don't think people realize there's so much emotion wrapped up in land transfer, and that it's not just a paper exercise of pro-con lists and does the money work, that there's emotions wrapped up in the conversation as well.
Absolutely. And it has to make sense to both parties,
Yep.
right? The landowner has to get a good deal and the city has to get a good deal. We were very fortunate in a recent project with the Ecola family. They actually were able to donate that project to the city, and we were able to step in and help offset some of the sort of transactive costs associated with that. But that was so excellent. They wanted to give back. They knew they had a lot of value in that project. The OLC and CONCOM both saw the value in that, and we were able to close out in a pretty reasonable time frame. And being able to present Nancy Ecola with an acknowledgement along with the mayor, I mean, what a feel-good moment.
So that's a great project to reference because it's a recent project. Can you walk the listener through what was involved with that project?
Yeah, absolutely. So when we first evaluate a project, generally, we don't solicit folks directly. So they'll hear about the opportunity to potentially conserve land through some of our outreach efforts that certainly Aaron and others are engaged in. And so the Ecolas had, reached out to us. They had been interested in making sure that the wildlife they saw on their land was able to enjoy that land for future years. So it started with a site walk from the Open Lands Committee. We got some volunteers to go out and actually look at the property in person. We were able to meet with the landowners and discuss their priorities early on. And then we have a set of criteria in which any potential project is scored on. So it's an even playing field. And we look at a variety of different line items as part of that. But their property scored high. And the fact that they were willing to donate their development rights was huge in being able to move fairly quickly on this because we weren't worried about sort of the funding authorization at that level. But from there, it takes getting a conservation easement survey conducted. It involves going to the Conservation Commission to get approval for actually, expending some dollars associated with those transaction costs, like I mentioned, and then ultimately going to the City Council for its approval for actually accepting the interest in that property. And so once you go through all of those steps, you have that donation acceptance agreement in place, then you can finally get to the point of drafting up the language that's going to be in that conservation easement deed, which is ultimately recorded with the registry, sort of dictating the fact that development activities, other types of activities will not be allowed to take place on this land, and that the city of Dover does have an interest in ensuring that it's protected in perpetuity.
And that project was located off of Toland Road, correct?
This one was actually off of County Farm Cross Road. It was a little over 11 acres, but it helped connect existing conservation tracts in that area and build out
I guess that's what I'm thinking of, that bigger corridor.
Exactly.
Cool. Aaron, can you walk the listener through, you mentioned the website earlier, the project website. Is it just linked off of the planning department page, or is there a direct link, or how would someone find that information?
Yeah, so they can go to the planning department webpage on the City of Dover website. We have a master plan section where they can find all this information. They can also read through other chapters, other overviews of chapters in the master plan. It's all right there to check out.
One last question from me, and then I'll make sure you both have an opportunity to sign off. In the past, really everything but the vision chapter has an implementation table with recommended goals, objectives to meet. Are we continuing that with this, or is this more of an esoteric so it doesn't have that concrete project list?
This has been part of the discussion we've had with the steering committee about setting goals, specific goals for conservation, because it's kind of an ever-changing idea about conservation. There's only so much land in Dover. So there will be some action items as part of this chapter, but it's also kind of recommendations about conservation efforts for the future. We're looking at the next 10 years. So I would say it's a little bit of both.
Okay. Anything the listener should know?
I have a trivia question for you.
Okay.
Can you guess how many acres of land in Dover have been conserved?
Okay. So there's 18,000 acres minus the river. So there's about 15,000 usable acres. I'm going to go with just shy of a third of the community. So I would say, let's say 27% of the community is in conservation. So I'm bad with math. 27% of 15,000, whatever that is.
I think you're pretty
I'd
close.
say you're
Spot
pretty
on.
close.
Yeah.
It's about 3,700 acres.
Yeah.
3,700 acres. You were very close. And those are protected in various forms. Some are, publicly owned lands owned by the people of the city of Dover. Some are privately held conservation easements like we were talking about earlier. Others have been protected for water quality reasons or wellhead protection reasons. So it's a whole mishmash of different things that make that figure up.
Jackson, your time for a trivia question? I get to ask you both one.
Do I have a trivia question?
Let's stop while we're
I have a trivia.
I appreciate you both coming in. Aaron, it was pointed out that you might be a member of the Five Timer Club. I would actually argue that because you do the monthly updates, you're probably in the 15 Timer Club.
I think I'm over that. Waiting for my jacket.
Well, I was just thinking, what kind of tiara do we have in the outfit we could provide? We'll think of something.
Sounds good.
You're definitely making a run for the gold. Jackson, you got some room to grow.
I hope to be back on soon.
That competitive spirit is working well. I appreciate you both coming in today, and I hope you have a great rest of the day.
Thank
You as well. Thanks for having us.
Dover has a wealth of history in its over 400 years of existence. Coming up, Mike Gillis is going to share some of that history with us.
Dover has welcomed several sitting presidents to the Garrison City, and several more while candidates were on the campaign trail or stumping for other candidates or issues. But, and this may be good to know if it comes up in local trivia, do you know who was the first sitting president to visit Dover? On July 17, 1817, the 5th President of the United States, James Monroe, was the first U.S. president to set foot in Dover while still in office. President Monroe's stop in Dover came just months after he was seated for his first term and near the end of a tour of New England that started in Boston. Monroe and a small contingent had set out to inspect military defenses and bolster national unity. After leaving Portland, Maine, President Monroe was met in Dover by a large escort at the New Hampshire and Maine state line. Many of Dover's dignitaries were among the contingent on hand to greet the president. President Monroe was then escorted to the center of town, where he was greeted by many more dignitaries, an eager crowd of citizens and admirers, and a national salute by the artillery. From there, President Monroe was led to Wyatt's Inn at Tuttle Square, where he was to stay that evening in Dover, and then on to a location near the home of Colonel Cogswell, which is where St. Mary Academy stands today. Here, with a large crowd gathered around, one of Dover's most prominent citizens of the day, William King Atkinson, for whom Atkinson Street is named, said to President Monroe, quote, "Forming a small but component part of the great nation over which you preside, permit us, in behalf of the inhabitants of the ancient town of Dover, to express the lively sensibility with which it receives within its borders a personage so distinguished in obtaining and perfecting the independence of our common country." Atkinson would tell the president that Dover had no fortifications or attractions to view, as Dover was largely an agricultural community. Atkinson would go on to say that Dover's economy had suffered, as did many agricultural communities in the Western world at that time, due to a variety of factors. President Monroe responded by thanking Dover for the reception, adding he knew it was for the office of the president and not for the man who stood before them. From there, it was back to Wyatt's Inn, where he dined with a committee that had arranged for the festivities in honor of his visit to Dover. While there, President Monroe also did something seldom seen by a nation's leader, at least at a time before strict security. He walked out into the street to meet with the residents of Dover, spending considerable time among them. That evening, President Monroe was welcomed by another of Dover's dignitaries of the day, the Honorable William Hale, who hosted the president at his home. The next day, July 18th, President Monroe departed Dover for Concord, the next stop in a tour that would ultimately span more than 2,000 miles across dozens of communities. President Monroe's tour proved successful enough. He made 2 additional tours, first in 1818 when he toured the Chesapeake, and in 1819 when he toured the southern states. Despite what came to be known as the financial panic of 1819, as well as the Missouri crisis, James Monroe was reelected unopposed in the election of 1820.
Thanks for listening to the Dover Download this week. If you like what you heard, subscribe through your favorite podcast aggregator. And if you have something you want to hear a topic on, let us know. Finally, this is just one of the many ways we share information about the city of Dover. You can subscribe to the Dover Downloads email newsletter every week or other newsletters that we have by going to the City of Dover homepage, www.dover.nh.gov. Have a great week.